Hello and welcome to 1 Degree Shifts. I'm your host, Pascal, and today I have the honor of welcoming Jerónimo Mazarrasa. And Jerónimo, the first time I met him was around, I think 4 years ago. We met on a PAC board meeting, and Jerónimo kind of came in and dropped a bunch of really enlightening wisdom bombs and things that I still remember to this day, like moving at the speed of trust, which I really align with today still. And so I'm really honored to have him on the show today. And Jerónimo is the Director of Social Innovation at ICEERS Foundation. His work at ICEERS focuses on the integration of ceremonial plant medicines outside of their countries of origin. And ICEERS, their mission is to see a future in which ceremonial plant work can be practiced in the global north safely, legally, and in right relationship with the cultures of origin. So welcome to the show, Jerónimo. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
And today we're talking about this idea of the psychedelic enlightenment age. And a lot of people will hear about these days the psychedelic renaissance, which I personally don't love that term because it kind of ignores that the space or the work never went anywhere. It's always been a present, and people have been preserving these traditions for a long time. So it's not really a renaissance. But what do you mean by psychedelic enlightenment? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, this was an idea that came out of the concept came out of Jose Carlos Bozo, who's our ICEER scientific director, and he sort of questioned, well, if we're in the psychedelic renaissance now, and historically, after the Renaissance came the Enlightenment, what would the psychedelic Enlightenment be like? And that's what it is. It's sort of a thought experiment about what the future, what the next stage would be, or most importantly, what we would like the next stage to be in terms of psychedelics. And that's something that is very close to the work that I do on ICEERS in terms of sort of trying to model a future for, in my case, ceremonial plant work that we would like to see. Now, when people talk about the psychedelic enlightenment, usually what they mean is pharmaceutical psychedelics used in a clinical context that will be prescribed by doctors and will be taken by people with a medical diagnosis in the context of clinics and hospitals and sort of health facilities as Westerners understand health facilities.
And sorry, you mean the psychedelic renaissance, right?
Oh, sorry, did I say the Enlightenment?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's the psychedelic renaissance. The psychedelic renaissance is where we find ourselves now, and this is usually what people mean. So when the psychedelic renaissance sort of happens, will take place, we will have doctors will have the right to legally prescribe psychedelics to people that meet a certain sort of diagnostic criteria. So this is very much the fitting of psychedelics as we know them into the context of our Western health model, and they become one more medicine in the toolkit of medicines. Of course, this is a wonderful thing. It's opening the doors for the mainstreaming of psychedelics, which were, I have to, something is good to remind. Sometimes they were extremely rare thing in our societies. Usually less than 1% of the population has had any experience with them. So they were not at all something popular, and they are becoming known, and they're becoming mainstream. They're becoming accepted. They're gaining legitimacy. So I don't want to. There's a lot of things, about the psychedelic renaissance that should be looked at, but I don't want to also take away from its importance. And in a way, this is what we all who've been in this sphere for a long time dream. We would dream a future in which, psychedelics were respectful, to say the least, or interesting, and a subject of science and study like they've been for many of us. However, it is also in a way, a very restrictive concept in the sense that, well, it's very restrictive. It's only for doctors to prescribe. By doctors, I mean people who went to our universities and got a degree, so they have the legal ability to prescribe things. It can only be given to people who meet a certain diagnosis criteria, so people who are sick, ill, and it happens in a clinical setting. And this sort of obviates the fact that a big percentage, if not the majority, of psychedelic use, and I would even say psychedelic benefit, up to now, up to the psychedelic renaissance, was basically done by people who were not doctors and for people who did not have a medical diagnosis. Now, that doesn't mean it's helped a lot of people with different conditions, but the majority of people taking psychedelics did not have these conditions and still benefited greatly from these things. So something that worries me and many other people is that opening the door of psychedelics as prescription medicines, which is a good thing in and of itself because people will have access to these powerful medicines, but opening this door might automatically, if we're not careful, close many other doors, because now psychedelics is only something that doctors can prescribe, and now psychedelics is only something that people with a medical diagnosis can take. But the benefits of psychedelics are much wider. I would even argue that the main benefits of psychedelics are actually, and where psychedelics are most effective, are actually with people who are relatively healthy and don't have very serious conditions. Now, that doesn't mean that psychedelics cannot help people with serious conditions. That this means that when there are serious conditions in place, the level of the container that has to be built around them, because psychedelics are so powerful, is really it has to be quite tight. And you don't need such high security measures when you're dealing with people who are relatively healthy. So, you could also give the same example for yoga. It's not that yoga cannot benefit people with injuries, but people with injuries have to be extra careful with yoga because they could get injured worse. So to get to your question, what I understand the psychedelic enlightenment to be, or what we would like the psychedelic enlightenment to be, it's if the psychedelic renaissance, it's, pharmaceutical psychedelics for prescribed by doctors for people who have medical conditions in a clinical setting. For me, the psychedelic enlightenment would be it's complementary. So it's not one or the other, but it's how they complement each other. And we're not talking about pharmaceutical psychedelics, but plant-based psychedelics. We're not talking about people with medical conditions, but we're talking about non-medical uses where they're not prescribed by doctors, but they are administered by people who are not doctors, but they have training in plant medicines. And it's not a clinical setting, but a community setting. That would be
Right.
the psychedelic enlightenment. The psychedelic enlightenment would be the integration of this whole other sphere also into our societies, also in a legal way, also legitimate, also respected. So the non-medical uses of plant-based psychedelics in community contexts, and how we open up a space, a regulatory framework, a space in our societies to accept this so that this work can also happen legally and safely, just like we're working in, having legal and safe medical psychedelic use.
Right. And so much of what ICEERS works at and what you're personally working at as well is examining how this space is growing and researching the ancestral and ceremonial indigenous roots of these medicines and looking at ways to implement those things and join them into this renaissance so that, as you said, something more holistic, more complete can be offered to the population. And the question I often have is, do we have the spiritual fabric to grow this space well, in the sense of we're bringing the money in, we're bringing the medical and the legal and the policy things into this, and yet there's so much wisdom and so much things that we can learn from the past and from the people that are already doing this type of work in a different setting that we need to implement and incorporate and have discussions and collaborations with, so that we can have a more resilient spiritual fabric to hold these medicines, because they are spiritual vehicles, they are spiritual experiences. And right now, in terms of the Western model, from the medical perspective, those kind of conversations and thinking is not really part of the conversation. Is that accurate?
Yes. At ICEERS, we would like to see a future in which these, I would say psychedelics, but these sort of plants or substances, are as useful and as beneficial to us, to our societies, as they are to the societies of origin, what you can see that happens in societies where they've had relationships with these plants that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. They become enormously important, culturally speaking, and they become, very beneficial for the society. Now, in the West, we've had a pretty bad track record of incorporating these plant medicines, in the sense that we have actually a very good track record. We've incorporated almost all of them, some of them incredibly quickly. For example, tobacco, which was, just sort of spread like wildfire, soon after Europeans came in contact with it. But it has never become as beneficial for us as it was for them. Quite the opposite. It's in many cases, it's become quite toxic, right? So this is a pattern that repeats itself. We saw it with the coca leaf, we see it with tobacco. The way we use psychedelic mushrooms resembles nothing the original use. And you could even say the way we use cocoa, which you turn into chocolate, also doesn't resemble any, So this is, to me, similar, like, if you were, say, some extraterrestrial culture, came and became interested in wine, and then they decided that they were just going to do it all by themselves, and they didn't need to learn anything from, Mediterranean people who've been drinking wine for, 5,000 years at least, right? And of course, you can absolutely do this, and, and they might even discover new and interesting ways to make wine and drink wine, but for sure on the way, they're going to make a lot of mistakes, because that's what happens when you're new at something. You're not very good at it. Nobody is. And you make mistakes, and that's how you learn. But you can also learn from people who already made these mistakes, and maybe it's quite basic sort of thinking, and yet it's almost entirely missing, in our approach to these things historically. So the result has been that these powerful things, because they are very powerful, have sort of the power have been inverted. It's something. I mean, it happens with all powerful things. You can use a backhoe to make to dig a trench that will bring water to people's houses, or you can use it to destroy a house. It's not that backhoe is good or bad. It's just it's simply powerful, and that's what these substances are. This has happened every time, and that with all these plants that we have encountered, except one, which is a recent, exception, and it's ayahuasca. When you look at an ayahuasca ceremony in the West, you're going to see something that that very much resembles a traditional ayahuasca ceremony, a traditional Amazonian ayahuasca ceremony, and I'm using the word traditional widely, to include indigenous groups and also the ayahuasca churches. It resembles it. Now, this, for us that work with ayahuasca, seems sort of common sense. Of course, this is how you drink ayahuasca, but it's not common sense at all, in the sense that it had never happened before. There's sort of a very singularity, a very important historical exception that is happening there. And that shows that actually, culturally speaking, for whatever reason, we are able to do this. So we are actually able to learn this, some of the accumulated wisdom from people who have been doing things longer than we have. We haven't done much of it in the past, but we seem to, culturally, seems that things are changing. Now this is, of course, more complex than this. There's many issues. There's issues of sustainability of the ayahuasca vines and the plants. There's issues of, cultural appropriation. I don't want to gloss over these things. All of these things are there. They're very important, and but I also don't want to miss this, what I think is a very important thing that is happening with ayahuasca, which is that for the first time, a plant teacher from the Americas has traveled to the West with some of its original sort of context or way of use, wisdom around the use, you could say. And this is a very, very positive development, in my opinion. Now, it gets tricky in terms of commercialization. It gets tricky of recent developments that are happening where, it's not an ayahuasca ceremony, but it's a sort of buffet offering of a weekend retreat where you can have ayahuasca, cambo, bufo, mushrooms, iboga, San Pedro, and there's sort of some sort of like a menu where people get to pick and choose. There's also great sort of compression of the number of ceremonies and the number of time. None of this has any connection whatsoever to indigenous ways. They never mix these plants together. They never pack things like that, etc., etc. There's a lot of questions there, and it's really up to us how well we manage this. And by us, I mean the people who are engaging with these plants and these psychedelics.
Right. And you talked about this before in terms of, and that is so important as the space is accelerating and as the space is growing and as more people come into this, and everyone wants to open a retreat these days, it seems like, and everyone's so curious about these different medicines and how to use them. And a lot of them are kind of learning as they're going, and as we all are, and nothing is perfect. And at the same time, something that I thought was really interesting in your talk was this idea of the gift of the gods, which was that, anything can be a blessing or a curse, or it can be medicine or poison. You gave chemotherapy as a great example of, like, in small doses, it can be medicine, and at higher doses, it is a poison, but at higher doses it can literally kill you. And it's the same with psychedelics. And I would love for you to talk about that a little bit more, because I do feel like there's a sense of exceptionalism with psychedelic medicine, as if it's always good, but it can actually create a lot of harm. And at the same time, as the space is growing, there's a lot of doors that are closing to ceremonial practices and these containers that have held the medicine for thousands of years. And in some countries, they're more persecuted than ever. Like in Europe, for example, there's places where there's persecution of that. And I currently live in Indonesia, where it's highly illegal. I mean, you can go to jail for 5 years for having a few coca leaves. And ICEERS actually was involved in a case like that recently. And so can you talk a little bit more about that idea of gift of the gods in relationship to plant medicines and what that means for you?
Yeah, the gift of the gods, it's an old myth. I came to it because, or I used it because I find it's actually a lot. There's a way to talk from different sort of like academic or scientific angles about what these cultural encounters mean and how plants are imported and why people in some cultures have different relations and abuse or not abuse of the plants. And it's a gigantic wormhole. I spent better part of 20 years sort of thinking about and reading about this, and and what addictions is and how they change from place to place, and what cultures get in trouble with which substances and why, and what are the pharmacological reasons, and what are the sociological reasons, and what are the psychological reasons why people fall into patterns of abuse or not, or positive. This thing is, you can really literally spend a lifetime. And what I found was that, on the other hand, a very simple, very old myth contains a sort of a nugget of truth and explanation that does a pretty good job at actually explaining what's going on, without the need of much else. It's an old myth. It takes different shapes in different cultures. But there's a part of it that is sort of common, which is the part that I tell. The myth, because it sort of goes, like most myths. It's a creation myth. It says at the beginning of time, at the time of the first people, the gods gave the humans, the people, a gift. This was a very powerful gift, but it came with a catch. Depending of your relationship to the gift, it could be a blessing or it could be a curse. So if you approach the gift, with respect and wisdom, then the gift would sort of flower and, and shower blessings on the people. But if you approach the gift with disrespect or with ignorance, then the gift would turn into a curse, and it would just wreak havoc and just bring great destruction, right? The part that changes when in this myth in different cultures is that they don't say there was a gift. They say the gift was this, it was a thing in particular. But the part that's universal is that you can actually change that, and it works for many, many things. So, you can say that, the gift was fire, and, fire can cook a meal and can keep you warm, or it can, burn a forest and, pollute the earth and the air, or the gift, today could be artificial intelligence. Is it going to be a great blessing, or is it just going to destroy the earth? Well, either way is absolutely possible, and it depends on this relationship. So the gift is a metaphor about the types of relationships we establish with powerful things, generally speaking, but just the type of relationships we establish, period, also with one another. Our relationship to life, our relationship to optimism, our relationship to work, our relation to love, to sex, could be, positive and life-giving, or it could be, life-destroying and negative. None of these things are, there. It's in the nature of the relationship, right? So, especially with these plants, and with these compounds, because they are so powerful. There is, I think, this is slowly changing, but during the early beginning of the psychedelic renaissance, there's been this implicit idea that, okay, there's been accidents in the past that's because doctors were not administering this. But when doctors administer this, and they do it in a clinical setting, and they do proper screening, then we can do away with the challenging effects, and the sort of like and the extreme reactions, and the quote unquote bad trips. This, of course, has yet to be proven. Is basically wishful thinking. The little we know about how some of this clinical research is going points to the direction that points to the direction of something that we already knew in the underground. That these things mostly go very well, to extraordinarily well, and then every once in a while, for reasons that nobody's sure of, and they're very hard to pinpoint, people have extremely weird, challenging, difficult, long-lasting problems with this. As long as it was in the underground, just sort of chuck it to the risks of the. Now, as this becomes a legitimate legal thing that is covered by insurance and all of these things happen, I fear that the lawsuits are going to be epic. There is, among other things, because we are talking about turning this into a prescription medicine, that means that your doctor is going to tell you that they think that you should take this. This is not, this I would say already breaks one of the main counterindication of psychedelics. I would say that the main counterindication of psychedelics is not wanting to take psychedelics. You should never take psychedelics if you don't want to, because they're awful if you don't want to. I tell my children, it's like a kiss. If you want it, it's the best thing in the world. It's so sweet and wonderful. And if you don't want it, it's the sloppiest, most disgusting, intrusive, awful thing you could have. And psychedelics are the same. So if your doctor is going to tell you that you should take something, and then you take it because your doctor told you, and then you have an awful time, you're going to be very, very angry with your doctor. And that's where the lawsuits, I'm afraid, are going to come.
Right. So the question here that you're sharing about, which is a very big question, and when you say the lawsuits are going to be epic, and you're talking about this medical system that is kind of overlapped or over the traditional ceremonial settings of delivery and the people delivering these medicines in those cultures, how do you imagine then, how will they live side by side? And of course, that's a big part of ICEER's work, and it's obviously a big question. but you're talking about prescriptions and doctors prescribing medicines for different pathologies that may not even be present or may not even exist, and potentially not having the right skills to administer these things and really hold people well before, during, and after. And in your talk at Psychedelic Science, you talked about this idea of shamanic practices, and you've done a study on this, which I thought was really interesting, is how can indigenous elders and teachers and medicine people, could they potentially work with Western scientists and doctors, and how will they communicate and talk to each other so that they can complement each other with the skills that they do have? They have skills in different areas, but how can they potentially work together to create something greater than the sum of its parts? And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that, because as you've said before, there's no guarantee that these very useful and old traditions and wisdom are going to be included in the psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, this idea is that it's not research, but more like a personal study. Came out of I was in a psychedelics conference years ago, and I found a quiet room to do some work, and the room slowly got filled. I didn't know, but it was a closed door meeting of people who were to be future psychedelic therapists. So most of them were psychologists, and they were in close. They were just talking to each other, and I was happened to be overhearing because I was working there. And two things blew my mind about the conversation. That one person sort of raised their hand and said, I want to know if anybody else has this problem, but I just find it that, I have to sit next to a person. I administer, in this case, mushrooms, psilocybin. I have to sit next to the person. And then very often during the duration of this, which is, 4 to 6 hours, nothing much happens and I don't have to do anything. And I'm just sitting there, and I just find it really, really boring. And I wonder how you deal with the boredom. He was asking to the other, And then another question that came up, and this was a serious question, was like, are we sure that is it necessary for me to also know this substance, to also have tried this substance myself, before I give it to other people? These were the two questions that are being discussed, and both of them blew my mind, because coming from traditional practices, I mean, these are non-issues, and they're related. You're bored, you're bored because you can't sing, and you're bored because you didn't take the medicine with the patient. And I would take it one step further. If you look at the indigenous traditions, these plants are mostly for doctors and occasionally for patients. So if someone has to take it, it's the doctor, not the patient. And I know this absolutely puts Western science on its head, but I think that's precisely the point of this conversation, and that these things should be taken into account. I think the most revolutionary power of psychedelics, is not in treating people with really difficult mental conditions, though there is some usefulness there. And it's not even non-medical applications of psychedelics. It's what happens to doctors when they start taking this, and how that revolutionizes their worldview and the way they deal with their patients. I would say there's an even crazier idea there, that this would be after the psychedelic enlightenment, which is what happens when doctors begin to do this. There was in Spain. I'll just go in a slight tangent and come back to your question. In Spain, as you know, there was a fascist dictatorship for 40 years, Catholic military, very conservative. And they had a very well-known psychiatrist that was the psychiatrist of the regime, the Dr. López Ibor. So he was, as you can imagine, an extremely conservative psychiatrist, and he was always in the news, in the TV when they ever talked to a psychiatrist. He was the one on TV. He was the official psychiatrist. So very conservative, very Catholic, very, very. But these people were also experimenting with LSD in the 50s, like many other university, and they asked him about LSD in an interview, and he said, I think LSD would be the initiation ritual of the psychiatrists of the future. And that's something, that was thought about, then forgotten, is not exactly on the table now, in the conversations, but it is perhaps where the revolution happens. The revolution, quote unquote, does not happen, when the patients are healed. There is a healing that takes place. But in terms of the revolution, every doctor that changes their perspective affects, hundreds of patients over decades. That's where, if I had a few million, that's where I would focus on. I would give this to the doctors and see what happens. And this is also what we learn from indigenous use.
Right. And there's a saying sort of like in psychedelic activists, sort of young activists, psychedelic activists, about putting MDMA into water supply and everything would be fixed from there. But actually what you're saying is, let's give some medicine to the doctors.
Yeah, not to the politicians. Exactly. It's not about Donald Trump. So then to go back to your question, today doctors, the training that doctors receive. So you might have, two PhDs from Yale, one in psychiatry and one in, neuroscience. You've been studying 20 something years. You are, widely considered, the person who knows about, mental health conditions, etc., etc., etc. You are the person who are going to be prescribing the psychedelics. And there's nothing in your 20 years of training, nothing that actually trained you to sit next to a person, to the type of things that will happen when you sit next to a person who's going a psychedelic experience. As a matter of fact, all your training is about giving people things to bring the symptoms down, not to sit with them while their symptoms temporarily increase. So, there's a deep discomfort by the nature of the training that comes when you give something to someone and they become more agitated, more excited, more everything, which is what psychedelics do. And very often, of course, and this is very quickly, and there's even, startups and they're developing things about this. The question is, but is there an antidote? Can I make this stop? Can I make this stop with another drug? Not can I make this stop with something that I have to do, with an actual intervention that, requires me as a person to engage. Is there a pharmacological antidote that I can give? Because what's being described makes me very uncomfortable. So, there's discomfort, there's boredom. So boredom when nothing happens, discomfort when things do happen. And generally, a terrible lack of training that is not being addressed. It's not being addressed in the sense that it's not being recognized. It's saying, well, this is a medicine, and people who administer these substances are doctors, and doctors obviously will be the ones to administer this. And, they will need some training, but this training, we're talking about a few weeks, at most. This is what the trainings for doctors are looking like. This is, of course, doctors are very well trained. They don't need much additional training to do screening, I would say, for psychedelics. They will need some few things, but in terms of pharmacological interactions, the screening, certain counterindications, our doctors are very well prepared for that. They just need a little extra. And, some of our doctors could be very good talking to people after the experience. They would need, again, a little bit extra of, some particularities about, this type of experience. But generally speaking, they have pretty solid or psychological training. It's pretty solid. They can be pretty solid in terms of talking to people and helping them integrate these things. But in terms of what happens during, they are just as bad at it as somebody who no medical training who just started, because they have, as a matter of fact, it could be that a psychiatric nurse has better training or a better starting point to simply be with someone during the experience than a psychiatrist. That's certainly a psychiatrist, and and most likely also a psychologist, because psychiatrists are just used to they're trained to give people things to bring the symptoms down, and psychologists are trained to talk to people after something happens, not to be with them while it's happening, right? So
Right.
so at least, psychiatric nurses are actually trained to be with someone while something is happening, that can be alarming.
They don't get bored.
Right. So we have these doctors, they're going to have all the permits, and they have the before and the after very good, and then we have these people who are, traditionally trained, or they just learn through experience. There's all sorts of, underground ways. They might not have a medical license. They might not have a medical a degree. They might not have any proper degree, but they actually have the experience to deal with this, not just one by one. They can actually manage groups. They know what to do when people are having challenging experiences, and they could really use help with the screening and the integration. Right. So in an ideal world, there's a beautiful collaboration that could happen there, that needs to happen there. And in some places, it is already happening. These I've seen happening in some of the, psilocybin clinics that are starting in the Netherlands and in other countries, where they end up hiring, people that come from ayahuasca, from traditional world, to run the actual ceremonies, while, there's a team of doctors and psychologists that do the screening and the integration and all of this afterwards. This hopefully would be a middle step before a time in which you have two complementary services. You have clinics where people who have very serious conditions are treated, and they are run by doctors, and they are using pharmaceutical psychedelics. And then you have something else that doesn't even have a name. We can call it centers. We can call it, I don't know. And these places will be sometimes in the cities, sometimes outside in nature. And there will be places that have more to do with what I would call transitions or life crises. But these are not medical conditions. This is not people who have a medical diagnosis. And yet they're going through some period in their lives, some change, some difficulty, some confusion, right? That would greatly benefit from taking some time off, going to a place where people who are trained in handling these plants, and in a community setting, in a group setting, not an individual setting, will sort of engage in this process that is usually longer, that is it's maintaining time. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years, as they sort of process, this transition. And I think transition is the right word. And transition includes many things. It includes when we have to deal with a terrible loss. It includes when we have to change or grow up into something bigger. It includes when there's different challenges, when we have to take a step that we are afraid to take. There's many words for it. And generally speaking, this is a place where psychedelics can be really, really helpful.
Yes, thank you. And what I'm hearing essentially, Jerónimo, is this idea of the essential collaboration between the ancient traditions and the plant ceremonial traditions and this newer medical kind of Western perspective, and really the essentiality of collaborating so that we can create a better system together. It's not about one being better than the other. It's working together and speaking more together. And part of that is really acknowledging the empirical accumulation of knowledge that's happened over thousands of years. And are we able as a society, as a modern society, to accept this other type of science and seeing it as science as well? I think there's a sort of perspective in the Western world about, well, science is numbers and everything's a straight line, but actually in the ancient wisdom traditions, it's a lot more non-linear, essentially, and it connects with different senses. It connects with different parts of our brain and our heart and our spirit, and different languages, even in terms of connecting to plants. And it's all kind of foreign to us, and yet there needs to be a lot more humility in how we're approaching this to include those voices. And from what I'm hearing, your sort of perspective on the psychedelic enlightenment era is around including, listening, collaborating, humbleness, and instead of competition, collaboration, those type of ideas that plants often try to teach us as a human species.
Yes, I mean the future needs to be imagined, right? The future happens, but it also happens in a direction that often, sort of it matches things that that we imagine. So futuristic cars look like futuristic cars in science fiction movies, right? Not because the science fiction movies predicted the future, but because they made a model of it. And then when you want to make a futuristic car, you make it look like the ones in the movies. And then at the end, the cars of the future resembles the cars of the future in the movies, right? This exercise of how we create a future that becomes an attractor for the actual future, you know, it's part of a lot of the work that I do, or is at the core of the work that I do. So in terms of imagining this, what I imagine is first a collaborator, so first a collaboration, between doctors and between doctors and traditional facilitators. Then a legitimization of traditional uses as they are, you know what I mean? Not exactly as they are, but this idea of the center, and this is a new space for us. This is something that didn't exist. We have lost it. We have hospitals, we have churches, and we have universities, but we don't have a name even for a place that is therapeutic, but is not a hospital, that is spiritual, but is not a church, and that it's something to do with adult education, but it's not a university. But this is what we're talking about. This is that place. That place it's emerging and will emerge. And I imagine a future in which most cities in the world have a place like this, or many outside and inside, where people know that they can go for these things.
Right. Yeah,
That's
there's a part of that that's a language and cultural thing, and that's a kind of a lagging sort of thing that takes a long time to change, like social cultural norms and things of that nature. And it brings me to the next question, which is this idea of the space is growing and people are sort of in a mad rush to train a bunch of therapists. I was on a call this morning where I heard that a friend of mine, where in Canada, she's a real estate agent, and she was a real estate agent as far away as just 6 months ago, and she took a training at a retreat space over 3-4 days, and now I'm learning that she's pouring medicine for people. And God bless her, she's a lovely person, but 3 or 4 days is not enough of a training to serve medicine. And so when I hear about sort of the growth of this space and this mad rush to train thousands of different therapists, and there's many programs out there. I think there's like 80 or 90 different programs of facilitators. How do we grow the training of these people that are going to serve this new demand, and at the same time bridge indigenous wisdom, ways of doing and practicing, which often surrounds itself around this idea of apprenticeship over many years? And yet there's this want and need to grow really quickly. But how do you blend that sort of demand and really the crisis that we're facing with this indigenous way of training and learning, which can take many years? How do you see that? Do you see that model of including those voices and having these sort of middle way places and training programs to sort of be the building blocks for something that is much more culturally driven, in a sense that eventually this will just be the ceremonial way of doing things will just be naturally included in this new way of serving the earth and people, really?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky question, right? And it's not unique to this. It happens with every new profession. So, another thing that I've done is I've looked at how other new professions got established. For example, coaching. There was a time when coaching was a very rare thing. And as it began to grow, there was some suspicion and criticism coming from psychologists who were saying, who the hell are these people giving advice and listening and giving advice? That's my profession, and these people are not psychologists, and they're giving advice, and and this could go very wrong. And they had a point, and there was a point where there was a process by which coaching became more legitimate, by coaching became officialized, by training and and certifications came into place, and also in which, very clear boundaries were made between what is coaching and what is psychology, and where coaches should not go and where coaches can go. This is especially true for the most professional coaching. I don't want to insult anybody, but executive coaching, people working with businesses are very, very professional that way, professionalized anyway. And then there's a sort of a free-for-all thing with life coaches and purpose coaches, and which again, I don't want to take anything away from the work that they do, but it's a more open environment, more flexible. So it's closer to for example, art. And anybody who wants to make music, they make music. You don't need, nobody was going to certify that you're a musician, right? It's your music that does it. All of these things are there and will remain there. But generally speaking, and there's a lot of this sort of pushback in terms of, I'm being, repressed or whatever, or I should be free to do what we want to do, or I'm being, pressured or controlled, So everybody should be free to do what they want to do. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. Nobody has the right to tell you or to control you, including governments, etc., much less what you do with your own body, which you are absolutely sovereign over. With that said, when you administer a powerful psychedelic plant to somebody else, then you have a responsibility now towards that person. The same way that, if I'm walking on the sidewalk, I'm free to do what I want. I can jump, I can do cartwheels, But if I'm driving a bus and there's 40 people in the back, then I am just less free than I would be if I was working on the sidewalk. And that's just it. It's like that. There's a responsibility over others, especially if your actions might harm them. So as you grow in responsibility, as you go from drinking ayahuasca to serving ayahuasca, that is a gigantic step in responsibility. When you're drinking ayahuasca, well, you might drink it better or worse, but hey, it's your life, it's your body. Ultimately, if you want to, hey. However, when you start serving to other people, that's something else, And then, just about anybody can, take a boat out into the lake and bring it back if the day is sunny and the water is flat. It's not very difficult. It might take some trick, but you can sort of do it, and you bring it back, and you might have a little whatever, but you will do it, and you might do it, a decent job of this. However, when the wind blows and there's a storm and there's 3-meter waves, then we're going to see who are the sailors and who were the hobbyists. And the thing with psychedelics is that sooner or later, there is going to be, 3-meter or 10-meter waves. And again, if you're alone in your house experimenting, psychonaut, whatever, okay. But if you just gave this to other people and took their money, it's really as simple as that. How long will it take for this common sense, which is all it is just common sense? How long will it take for this common sense to sort of trickle down into the scene? I don't know, but eventually it will. When people discovered X-rays, they went crazy with it, and they were doing X-rays to pregnant women, and they were doing, very, very long X-rays. Everybody was playing with it. It was so much fun to see inside the bodies of people, and so interesting, and so many things were being discovered, and it took quite a few years before people realized, holy shit, wait a minute, this is radioactive, and we have to. There's all sorts of, safety measures that have to be added in order to be able to use this safely, and beneficially. I think we're in that process. The problem is that this process, which happens naturally, where people learn by making mistakes, and then everybody sort of the level rises, becomes stunted when the practices are underground or forbidden. So, surfers in a beach learn very, very quickly from each other what the good tricks are. or skaters, or or just anything, baristas. Have you seen, in the 80s they started drawing, tulips on on cappuccinos, and now they can make the Mona Lisa, right? This is like, they just learn from each other very, very fast. Humans are very good at this. It happens by itself. No need to, unless it is forbidden and underground. And then this flow of knowledge does not happen, or does not happen the same, or it happens very slow. So we've been taking LSD for 60 years, or LSD has been in our culture for 60 years. Are we much, much better at it than we were 60 years ago? I guess, but not compared with skating. You look at the way we're skating 60 years ago and how they're skating now, and it's like, it's another planet, right? And the reason is this, right? So, part of the work that I do and that we do at ICEERS is try to make sure that these best practices from indigenous facilitators, but also from non-indigenous facilitators, have the possibility of flowing, and people, and this knowledge can sort of pollinate each other, and that's the work that we do in our training program in ICEERS Academy. So we have 2 training programs, one for people who plant facilitators, and it's about safety, legal safety, psychological safety, and physical safety, and one for health professionals, and it's on integration. So this is for people that already work and just to help people after the experience. But these are not like many of the stories that I told today, if not all of them. This is not my ideas. All I'm doing is collecting things that are out there that I heard, good practices, good, interesting knowledge, good insights, and just sort of pulling them together and trying to pollinate them and spread them, because I don't work with plant medicines, so I can be public about this. I don't have to worry about what my service is or how I give back to the plants, for all the wonderful things that they did to me. I did not become a plant facilitator. I don't work with plant medicines. I work with people who work with plant medicines.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. And thanks for doing that work. And it's so important. I have 2 more questions. I really wanted to mention this because I thought it was really beautifully put, where you called ceremonial cultures and practices in this space as keystone species. And this idea of keystone species, we can see it in nature, where, for example, when you pluck wolves out of the Yellowstone Park in the US, it changes the entire ecosystem. And when you put them back in, all of a sudden there's a lot more health and flow and energy that goes through the web of life there. And you see ceremonial practices as the same for psychedelic, the psychedelic space in general. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea of keystone species?
Okay, keystone species. Yes. Yeah, it's exactly as you say. Keystone species. Basically, in ecosystems, there is a number of species that, when they go extinct, it has some effect on the ecosystem, but the effect is not hugely significant. And then there's other species that when they go extinct, the effect on the ecosystem is gigantic, and these are called keystone species. Usually, keystone species are the ones that have the most relationships. That's why, so they have relationships with the most other species. That's why when they're taken out, they have such a big effect. I consider ceremonial plant practices to be a keystone species in the larger psychedelic ecosystem, because they have the most relationships, because they deal with indigenous and non-indigenous, with medical and non-medical, with doctors and non-doctors. So even though they are, for example, you look at the number of people who take psychedelic mushrooms, and it's gigantic compared to, for example, ayahuasca. So they're not the largest player by any means. And yet, I feel that if it gets lost, we would lose something profoundly important. Not just the connection back to the cultures of origin and all of the wisdom that comes from there, but a wider understanding of the application of these these, of the power of these plants and these substances.
Yeah, beautiful. And my last question is, you've been around for multiple years doing this work with ICers and on your own, and you've been on a quest and a beautiful journey of exploring the space and always being present to it and always attending to it. And I'd love to hear from you on a personal level. What gives you the most hope these days in the field, and what's really lighting you up in terms of what's happening, what's changing?
That's a good question. My daughter, my smallest daughter, some years ago, I mean, I guess she must have been like 8, something like this, 9. I was putting her to bed one day and she said, I still don't understand what you do for a living. And I told her, a long, long time ago, we don't know how long, a very long time ago, somewhere in the Amazon jungle, somebody, we don't know if it was a person or many, had this idea of putting these two plants together. And it was the first time that somebody had this idea. And they put these two plants together and they cooked it and they tried it. And, at first it looked a little bit strange, but then they tried it and they said, well, this is kind of interesting. And then his family saw what he was doing or she was doing, and they said, what are you doing? That looks kind of strange. But then they tried it and they thought, this is pretty interesting. And then the rest of the people in the tribe, they said, this family, they're doing something strange. But then when they tried it, they thought it was kind of interesting. And then the whole tribe was doing this. And then the tribe next door said, the tribe next door is doing something that looks kind of strange. But then when they tried it, they thought it was pretty interesting. And they started doing it as well. And then the other tribe, and then the other tribe, and then, eventually many, many tribes in the Amazon. And then from there, they begin to have cities in the Amazon. And then they went to the cities of the Amazon. And from the cities, they went to other cities in that country. And then it went to other countries, And now it's beginning to arrive here. And people are saying, I think this is kind of strange. But I think that when they try it, they're going to think it's pretty interesting. And that's my job, right? So I couldn't do what I do if I didn't think that this is unstoppable. And I think it's unstoppable because when I look at it historically, I see that that's all that's happened. This, ayahuasca in particular has done nothing but expand since the moment zero when someone put these two plants together. It has done nothing but expand. It's in the nature of it. I don't know. And it has a very simple explanation. People find it interesting, so it expands. It expands from person to person, saying, "Hey, this was interesting," and then it moves on to the next. Really, it's that simple. It's not a. You can call it. You can say that the plant has a design and stuff, but you don't even need to. Just human beings happen to find this interesting, and then useful. And what we can see in the cultures who have had a very long relationship with this is that it actually becomes deeply important for the culture. It doesn't become a side thing. This is also the nature of it. So I think these things will become deeply important for us as well. I don't know how long it will take. Maybe it will take 10 years. Maybe it will take 100. Maybe it will get. It will go underground again. Maybe they will make it illegal again, and go figure. What I know is that the genie is not going back in the bottle. It's unstoppable. It's going to happen. This is too useful, too important, too special for people to give it out. So they're not going to give it up. And eventually, the culture at large will come to terms with that. I'm not, in the short term, I'm not very optimistic. I think we're going to enter the stage where we were with the X-rays, where all the bad things are going to happen. And all of these things are coming up, all of these sort of bad uses and all of this. it's there's no. I wish there was a way around it, but I'm not sure there is. So in that sense, I'm sort of, sometimes I feel a lot of the work that I do is sort of, damage control. But I'm very optimistic for the further future, in the sense that I look at what happened in indigenous cultures, and I see the role that these plants play, and how they sort of integrate with the culture, with society, and how beneficial they are. And then I believe also that's sort of unavoidable.
Thank you. And I feel the same about the first point, and that's why I do what I do. And on the second point, well, thank you for all the work you're doing, controlling damage sometimes, but also sharing things on this podcast, for example, where it spreads little 1 degree shifts into the web of life and people get inspired to a new perspective. And all of a sudden, you've changed the lives of 1,000 people. So it's very important work you're doing. And how can people support ICEers, and how can people get involved in your really important work, really?
Yes, I mean, we're an NGO, we're a foundation based in Barcelona. We do our work, which is many things. We do scientific research. We do legal support, so we support people who get in legal trouble. We also have a support center where we help people for free who have, very difficult experiences. We give free advice about pharmacological interactions. We have a training program. We do policy work. We work with indigenous cultures and cultures of origin. It's a multifaceted issue, the globalization of plant medicines, and it requires a multifaceted approach. And that's what we do. We couldn't do any of this without the generous donations of the people who donate money for us and make it possible for us to basically devote ourselves to this. So, please visit our website, please donate. And if you sort of find this interesting, or you want to hear more, there's a lot of my talks online, but if you want to hear more precisely on the topic of better practices and best practices, there's a course I teach in ICEers Academy, which is on safety, where I go very, very into detail into sort of techniques and ways to increase the safety and avoid, hurting other people if you're going to give them plants. And we also have the integration program. So yeah, please, visit, take a look, please donate. That's how we keep this work going. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll put some links in the description of the show. And yeah, please donate and check out the courses. The program for integration, for example, is led by a really, really good integration specialist, Mark, who's a part of ICEers, and obviously Jerónimo for safety is really good people to learn from. So yeah, please support their work. And thank you so much for your time, Jerónimo, and blessings on your work and your journey. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Is it possible to add one last thing, sort of like a bonus?
Bonuses are always welcome. Please go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, it's just one topic that I only mentioned in passing, but I think it's important to just go a little bit more into, which is the topic of appropriation, on cultural appropriation, because I've spoken a lot about learning from indigenous people, but there is also a very bad ways of doing this. And I haven't spoken about it, but I would like not to leave that, without at least mention a little bit about this. I think people have a very misguided notion about what can be learned from indigenous people, from other cultures in general. And because of this misguided notion, they end up taking a sort of empty shells, simulacrums, so like, if I wanted to, so very often people go and they want to learn plant medicines, and what they do is they learn to sing some songs and make a shakapa, cook ayahuasca, and put on a dress or put on some feathers. We sort of grab, it's like we want Michael Jordan shoes to play better basketball, but Michael Jordan's basketball is not in his shoes, right? It's in the act of doing this, for decades. It's just, it takes decades to be a good basketball player. So how long do you think it would take to be a decent, facilitator of very powerful psychedelic experiences? Now, this gets doubly compounded in terms of difficulty. It's not impossible, but it gets even more difficult when you are talking about learning from an indigenous culture, which is very, very remote and foreign to you, which is happening in a foreign language. In this, because it's even much harder to grasp, the temptation to just grab the surface is even bigger. It's the temptation to just, copy the songs and copy the clothes and copy the feathers. And you can't. You're copying the gesture, but your ball is not going to go in the hoop because actually this takes years, right? But you're surrounded by people that don't know any better. So they can't tell. They can't tell if the ball is going in the hoop or not because, who knows? Nobody ever seen a basketball player in your town, right? So, you call yourself a shaman and you say this and, everybody's going to take it at face value. This is not what learning from indigenous people is. What learning from indigenous people is what the anthropologist said is control equivocation. Martin von Hildebrand, who's, he's been working with indigenous people for more his entire life, and it's a lot of amazing things. He once told me, I've been working with indigenous people for, I don't know, at that point it was 40 or 50 years, he said, and I still don't understand them. And they don't understand me, but we have a good time trying. So this is coming directly from the horse's mouth, 40 years, and you still don't understand, right? So it's not about understanding, contacting their spirits, or, it's about what inspires in you. And you have to understand that you're not learning. You were inspired into something, and you're not doing Shipibo shamanism. you came close to Shipibo shamanism, and it made you realize a number of things, which it does. I mean, this is the experience of any other culture. When you travel to other countries, you learn about yourself. You learn a little bit about them, but you mostly learn about yourself because they do things different to you, and you realize that you don't do them that way, and then that makes you think, and then you learn, right? And this is the anthropological experience. I mean, it's really rich and it's beautiful what happens when you come in contact with other cultures, because how much you learn about yourself and your culture. The mistake is thinking that you're learning about their culture because you're actually getting mostly things wrong. You're sort of projecting. It's a game of shadows. So there is a right way to do this, and it's possible to learn from indigenous people, but it doesn't involve taking things that are not yours and making cheap copies of them, and there's just no other, I'm sorry, there's no other way to say it, in Spain we have this, Frank Sinatra, has a number of songs in Spanish, they sound terrible. His Spanish is awful. He has a bad accent, but people who don't speak Spanish, they love it because it sounds great and it's Frank Sinatra, right? This is what we're talking about, right? You don't want to be that, you don't want to be that person singing in bad Spanish, right? Or if you're going to be that person singing in bad Spanish, you should know that Spanish people think you're funny and that you're not doing a good job. And that actually that song is not like that, right? Just to be sort of super blunt and honest with this, there is absolutely fantastic things that can happen, and much learning and collaboration that is possible and necessary and mutually beneficial. But just again, keep common sense. Keep common sense. It's really about common sense
and self-awareness and humility in knowing that you don't know, and that there's a lot to learn from others, and listen a little bit more and acknowledge the practice and that you can put the Jordan shoes on and become Jordan. That's a really good analogy. Actually, it's the best one I've heard so far. So thank you so much for sharing about that. That's important for people to hear and explore within themselves what it means for them to work this path and to learn from Indigenous people and learn about themselves. I think that's a really good point. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you
All
for
right.
letting me